buyer demand is basically still non-existent. Home sales in the Phoenix market, in Maricopa County in particular, are scraping at decade lows still.
The cameras were rolling when Governor Katie Hobbs froze mid-sentence, her voice cracking under the weight of Arizona's housing collapse. Behind her, charts showed Phoenix home prices plunging, construction halted, and thousands of families facing foreclosure. The once unstoppable desert boom had turned into a statewide panic, wiping out years of growth overnight. You could see it in her eyes. This wasn't just a political disaster, it was personal. The question haunting everyone in that room was the same. How did Arizona's greatest success story become its biggest heartbreak? How Arizona became the golden desert? It's hard to believe, but there was a time when Arizona looked like America's golden ticket. You couldn't turn on the news without hearing about the unstoppable growth in Phoenix, Scottsdale, and Tucson. The state was being sold like a dream, sun-soaked skies, wide-open land, and homes that promised a better life for half the price of California. It wasn't just real estate, it was a lifestyle. People didn't just move to Arizona for houses. They came chasing freedom, warmth, and a chance to cash in before prices climbed even higher. For a while it worked. The desert was printing money. Phoenix became the poster child of that dream. The city grew so fast it seemed like every cactus had a construction site next to it. You could drive out into the desert one week and come back the next to find a brand new subdivision. Rows of identical stucco homes popped up overnight, each one selling faster than the last. Real estate agents called it the Arizona Rush. Investors called it a gold mine. Retirees called it the good life. Everyone had their own name for it, but the story was the same. The desert was no longer empty. It was opportunity painted in sunshine and stucco. And the migration? It was wild. Californians packed up their Teslas, Washingtonians traded rain for rays, and New Yorkers swapped concrete jungles for backyard pools. They came in droves, convinced Arizona was the last affordable frontier. Remote work had given them wings, and Arizona's open spaces seemed like heaven compared to cramped apartments or sky-high rents. You could get a 5-bedroom house in Phoenix for what a parking space cost in San Francisco. People thought it would last forever. The growth, the profits, the illusion that the desert had no limits. The investors followed fast. Hedge funds and big property firms swooped in, buying entire neighborhoods before they were even built. They didn't see homes. They saw profit machines. They rented them out, flipped them, and pushed prices through the roof. Regular families trying to buy their first homes didn't stand a chance. Even builders couldn't keep up. Construction cranes filled the skyline, but demand still outpaced supply. Every open house turned into a bidding war, and prices jumped like a lottery jackpot. By the time Scottsdale's luxury condos started selling for Los Angeles prices, the warning signs were already there. Wages hadn't budged, but mortgages had doubled. Everyday Arizonans found themselves priced out of the very cities they built their lives in. It was growth on steroids, dazzling to look at, but dangerously unstable underneath. No one wanted to admit it. Politicians bragged about the boom, realtors promised it was different this time, and the media called Arizona the new California. But behind all that hype, cracks were forming. The golden desert had become too golden, too shiny, too inflated. Growth turned into obsession, and affordability vanished into the dry heat. By the time interest rates rose and buyers began pulling back, it was already too late. Builders had overbuilt, investors had overbet, and homeowners were left holding mortgages bigger than their dreams. What started as a paradise had turned into a pressure cooker, one built on debt, heat, and denial. The sun hadn't stopped shining, but the shine on Arizona's miracle had started to fade. Cracks in the mirage. The shift didn't happen overnight. It crept in quietly, almost like a mirage fading under the harsh Arizona sun. One moment, homes were selling in hours. The next, they were sitting untouched for months. The buzz around Phoenix real estate started to sound more like nervous chatter than celebration. Builders who once couldn't keep up with demand suddenly had entire subdivisions sitting empty. The smell of fresh paint fading into silence, and those luxury condos that were supposed to be symbols of endless growth, they became ghost towers, sleek, half-filled reminders that every boom comes with a price. People who had stretched themselves thin to buy before it's too late, were now stuck with homes worth less than their mortgages. You could feel the tension in neighborhoods that had once been full of excitement. Driveways that used to gleam with new cars were empty, foreclosure notices started popping up on doors, and for sale signs began to collect dust. The same agents who once promised that prices would never fall in Phoenix were suddenly offering quiet apologies and desperate price cuts. Behind the scenes, investors were already bailing. Institutional buyers, the same ones who had driven up prices by purchasing thousands of homes, started dumping them like bad stock. They'd made their money and were gone, leaving local families to deal with the fallout. It was a chain reaction. Builders stopped breaking ground. Workers were laid off. Construction sites turned into barren lots surrounded by unfinished walls. The energy that had defined Arizona's golden years vanished, replaced by uncertainty and fear. Governor Katie Hobbs felt that pressure more than anyone. She had built her political image around managing Arizona's growth, the promise of prosperity, innovation, and expansion. But as reports of the market's collapse flooded in, her carefully constructed narrative started crumbling. Every new statistic, the drop in home values, the spike in foreclosures, the slowdown in construction, chipped away at the state's identity. Arizona's endless growth myth was falling apart, and Hobbs was standing at the center of it. The breaking point came during that fateful press conference. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted, and Hobbs, usually composed and calculated, cracked under the weight of it all. Her voice trembled as she tried to defend the state's position, but the numbers spoke louder than her words. Property values plunging, investors fleeing, homeowners in tears. Arizona's housing dream was dead, and its collapse was being broadcast live. It wasn't just a financial crisis. It was a psychological one. For years, people had believed that Arizona was untouchable, that the desert could keep producing growth forever. That illusion was gone. Families who once bragged about escaping California's chaos were now facing the same nightmare. Rising costs, lost equity, and a future built on sand. And that's what made it so tragic. The Golden Desert didn't just lose its shine, it lost its soul. The very thing that made Arizona special, that spirit of reinvention and opportunity, had been consumed by greed and denial. When the dust finally settled, it wasn't just the housing market that was broken. It was trust. In the system, in leadership, and in the dream itself. The governor's breaking point. The press room felt like a storm waiting to break. Bright lights glared, reporters murmured, and Governor Katie Hobbs stood at the podium, clutching her notes a little too tightly. The Arizona flag behind her looked more like a backdrop for defeat than pride. Her tone was steady at first, rehearsed even, as she rattled off numbers about inflation, housing starts, and state recovery plans. But as questions flew, harsher, louder, more pointed, something inside her snapped. The governor, who had once embodied calm leadership, suddenly looked like a woman cornered by an economic avalanche she couldn't stop. "People are losing their homes," one reporter shouted. Another fired back. "What went wrong, Governor?" "You said the market was strong." The cameras zoomed in, catching every flicker of frustration on her face. Hobbs's composure cracked. She raised her voice, stumbling over words as she tried to explain that the crisis wasn't just Arizona's fault, that federal rate hikes, corporate greed, and investor pullouts had created a storm no one could control. But her words fell flat. The tension was raw, the fear visible. Behind her, aides exchanged panicked glances. They knew this wasn't the polished, composed governor the public was used to seeing. This was Katie Hobbs, stripped of her political armor, caught in the middle of a meltdown that mirrored the chaos sweeping across Phoenix. You could almost feel the room holding its breath as she slammed her notes down and snapped, "Do you think I don't know people are hurting?" The silence that followed was deafening. It was the moment Arizona's housing crisis stopped being a story about numbers and became a story about people. Her anger wasn't just frustration with the economy. It was exhaustion, fear, and guilt all colliding in real time. She had promised stability and growth. Instead, she was watching the state unravel. Families losing homes, investors disappearing, workers being laid off. The housing boom she once celebrated had turned into a full-blown disaster under her watch. Outside the capital, the effects were impossible to ignore. Phoenix's once booming suburbs were littered with for sale signs that refused to come down. Construction sites sat abandoned, their half-built frames baking under the desert sun. Homeowners gathered in community meetings, venting their fury over plummeting values and rising mortgage rates. It wasn't just an economic collapse, it was an identity crisis. Arizona's entire story had been built on growth, and that story was collapsing live on air. Hobbs's breakdown became instant headline fodder. Clips of her trembling voice and fiery outbursts spread across social media within hours. Some called it weakness. Others said it was the first time a politician had shown the same pain that people were feeling. Either way, the damage was done. Investors pulled back even faster, confidence tanked, and Arizona's housing freefall deepened. The irony was brutal. The same governor who once promised to manage growth responsibly was now the face of its downfall. And as Phoenix's glittering skyline faded behind the heat haze, one thing was painfully clear. The state that sold the dream of endless sunshine was finally burning under it, the fallout. After that press conference, Arizona changed overnight. The clip of Governor Hobbs losing her composure spread like wildfire, replayed on news channels, dissected by analysts, and turned into viral memes online. But behind all the noise, the real disaster was happening on the ground. Phoenix, once the golden child of America's housing boom, was crashing hard. Streets lined with half-built homes stood empty, their for sale signs flapping helplessly in the wind. Prices that had skyrocketed during the pandemic were collapsing faster than anyone could process. The same neighborhoods that symbolized the good life now looked like ghost towns. Buyers had disappeared. Institutional investors, who had once flooded Arizona's market with cash, were vanishing without a trace. Builders couldn't sell what they'd built, and many simply walked away from unfinished projects. You could feel the panic. Mortgage brokers closing offices, contractors laying off crews, families whispering about walking away from homes they could no longer afford. The dream had flipped upside down. Arizona's golden desert had turned into a desert of debt. The emotional toll was brutal. Couples who had stretched their finances to the limit were suddenly underwater. Retirees who had sold everything to move into peaceful Arizona communities were watching their life savings shrink. Even renters weren't safe. Landlords desperate to cover costs were jacking up rents or selling properties altogether, forcing people out of their homes. The air of optimism that once defined Phoenix had turned into one of fear and regret. People stopped talking about future plans and started talking about survival. Governor Hobbs became the face of that fear. Every headline tied her name to the collapse. Arizona governor breaks down as market crumbles, one read. Hobbs loses grip on housing crisis, said another. But the truth was, she wasn't entirely to blame. Arizona's entire economy had been built on an illusion that growth would never end, that demand would always outpace supply. The problem wasn't one leader's misstep. It was a system that had been running on borrowed time. Still, the fallout was personal. Businesses closed. Home builders who once bragged about record profits filed for bankruptcy. Banks tightened their lending overnight, and small towns that had boomed on construction money began cutting city budgets. Phoenix felt the brunt of it. A city that had grown too fast, too far, with too little to fall back on. And yet, amid all the chaos, there was something eerily familiar. Arizona had been here before, during the Great Recession, when Phoenix was ground zero for the foreclosure crisis. The same mistakes had been repeated: overbuilding, overconfidence, and ignoring the warning signs. The only difference this time was that people thought they were smarter. They weren't. By the time the dust began to settle, the illusion was gone. The glossy real estate ads stopped airing, the cranes stopped moving, and the desert quiet returned, not peaceful, but hollow. Arizona's housing market didn't just crash. It exposed the fragility of a dream sold to millions. And as Governor Hobbs' tearful image replayed on every screen, it became clear the crash wasn't just about homes. It was about hope and how quickly it can collapse when the foundation beneath it is built on sand. When the bubble finally burst, the crash didn't happen overnight. It crept in like a slow leak no one wanted to admit existed. But when it finally gave way, it was brutal. The Phoenix housing market went from red hot to stone cold in a matter of months. For years, everyone believed the desert boom would never end. Prices had doubled, developers were building faster than water lines could reach, and every backyard barbecue turned into a conversation about flipping houses or snagging the next big lot. But once the music stopped, there weren't enough chairs to go around. Interest rates climbed, and the whole illusion began to crack. People who had bought at the top suddenly couldn't afford their payments. Builders started canceling projects mid-construction, leaving empty shells baking under the sun. Mortgage defaults ticked up, slowly at first, then all at once. The same investors who had bragged about buying blocks of homes in cash were dumping properties before prices fell further. Panic was contagious. No one wanted to admit the bubble had popped, until it was too obvious to ignore. For ordinary Arizonans, it felt like a betrayal. Families who had believed in the promise of stability were left with mortgages higher than the value of their homes. Retirees who moved to Phoenix for a peaceful future were staring down evaporating home equity. The job cuts started soon after. Construction workers, real estate agents, and loan officers all hit within weeks. Restaurants near new developments closed. Schools saw families leave mid-year, and local governments faced shrinking tax revenues. The collapse spread like a domino effect. Governor Hobbs, who once celebrated Arizona's growth as proof of her state's success, now faced an unthinkable reality. Her entire economic base was disintegrating. Every press conference became an interrogation, every statistic a new headline. Phoenix down 20% in home values. Developers flee state. Foreclosures surge. It wasn't just bad optics, it was political quicksand. No policy speech could hide what was unfolding in real time. The craziest part was how quickly the mood flipped. The same people who had boasted about bidding wars and flipping houses for profit were now desperate to offload them. The state's so-called unstoppable growth engine had seized up, and behind closed doors, officials admitted it could take years to recover. Arizona's dream of endless prosperity had been exposed for what it was, a mirage shimmering in the desert heat. But maybe the most haunting part wasn't the money lost or the homes abandoned. It was the silence that followed. Streets that used to echo with construction noise went quiet. Open house signs gathered dust. Families stopped making plans for someday and focused on staying afloat. The Phoenix crash wasn't just a market correction, it was a reckoning, a reminder that no boom lasts forever, and that every glittering skyline can hide cracks deep enough to swallow an entire state's pride. Families who had stretched every dollar to buy during the boom were suddenly trapped. Their home values plunged while their mortgage payments stayed the same. Couples who once posted photos of their forever home were quietly calling realtors, begging for short sales before the banks moved in. Retirees who had sold everything to live out their golden years under Arizona's endless sunshine found themselves calculating how long their savings could last. Some walked away, others stayed, hoping the market would somehow bounce back before they lost everything. Governor Hobbs knew those stories all too well. Her inbox was filled with desperate emails, people begging for help, asking if the state could stop foreclosures or force banks to renegotiate loans. But her administration had few tools left. The banks were tightening credit, the investors were gone, and the federal government was focused on its own inflation battle. She was watching her state unravel one foreclosure at a time, powerless to stop it. That sense of helplessness weighed heavier than any political criticism. Meanwhile, the ripple effects hit everywhere. Construction companies shut down overnight, leaving workers without paychecks. Real estate offices that once couldn't keep up with demand turned into ghost spaces. Restaurants and small shops near the sprawling suburbs saw their customers disappear. Even schools felt the impact as families pulled their kids out and moved away, chasing cheaper rents or new jobs in other states. Arizona's growth, once its proudest achievement, had become the very thing dragging it down. The crash didn't just break wallets, it broke spirits. People stopped trusting the system that had promised them security. They felt deceived by politicians, betrayed by builders, and abandoned by banks. The desert, once marketed as a paradise of opportunity, started to feel like a trap. As one homeowner told a local reporter, "We didn't just lose our home, we lost faith in this place." For Governor Hobbs, that quote hit harder than any headline. It summed up the pain spreading across Arizona, the collective grief of a state built on confidence that had vanished. Her public breakdown suddenly made sense. It wasn't political weakness, it was shared despair. She wasn't just reacting to numbers on a spreadsheet, she was carrying the weight of thousands of shattered dreams, and that's what made the Phoenix crash so devastating. It wasn't just the fall of a market, it was the unraveling of belief in endless growth, in the safety of home ownership, and in the idea that the desert sun could shine forever. When the dust finally settled, one thing was clear: Arizona hadn't just lost value, it had lost innocence. So, what are your thoughts on this? Let us know in the comments below.